Hello, good evening. Welcome to North Lanarkshire Live. It's Lockdown Live, and it's day 388 of lockdown. We're getting to near the end there, 26th of April. We're all waiting for it. We're all hoping for it. Could see things opening up again, and things have started to open up. As most people watching will know, North Lanarkshire has been in Tier 4 for the majority of over a year. But tonight we have another politician to speak to, and that politician is Michelle Ballantyne of the...
Them, not you.
Sorry, you disappeared. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you fine.
Oh, you've come back again. Sorry, I missed that introduction. You suddenly disappeared.
So, Michelle, so you're from it's the Reform Party Scotland, is that correct? That's the correct name?
Yeah.
Correct.
Reform UK Scotland.
Reform UK Scotland, yeah, because there is a Reform UK, and then, as we've talked with other people,
Reform UK Wales, and Reform UK Scotland, yeah.
So, give us a little bit of background to yourself, because obviously you have been a sitting MSP in the past, yes? So,
Yeah, well, a quick whiz through then, because I'm getting on a bit these days, so I've got quite a long history, but I started life as a nurse. So I trained as a nurse, went on to staff in intensive care units, and then I decided that I wanted to have a look about, how the NHS actually was run behind the scenes. So I joined what was called the Graduate Finance Management Training Programme to learn basically how the money worked. Did sort of accountancy training with the NHS, then went on to the sort of management side, firstly in finance. Carried on nursing because I wanted to keep in touch with the front line. So I did a number of kind of strategic jobs, as well as my sort of nursing side. And then moved to Scotland in 1990 with my husband, who'd just come out of the forces. And we set up a manufacturing company, and I carried on working in the NHS, sort of being the breadwinner, if you like, where we built the company. And I went into the general management side in Edinburgh and worked there for a few years. Then I went into the third sector and headed up the drug and alcohol services for offenders and young people, before being elected as a councillor in Scottish Borders Council, and then becoming an MSP in 2017. So that's a quick whiz through. A bit of everything, public, private, and third sector.
So you've got experience of government, is what I'm trying to get to. Well, of being in Parliament. So you
Absolutely, yeah. All Scottish level.
How long were you in MSP for?
I've been in MSP for 4 years.
And that was with the Conservative Party, but now you're with the Reform UK Scotland Party.
Yes, I resigned from the Conservatives back in, was it September, October? Yeah.
So what was the reason for jumping to Reform UK?
Well, I didn't jump to Reform UK. I actually resigned from the Conservatives, though. It was a few bits and bobs, but culminated in the coronavirus decision making. I disagreed with the support the Conservatives were giving at the time for the decisions that were being made in Parliament. I wanted to vote differently. So that was kind of the straw that broke the camel's back, if you like. But the general direction of travel of some policies I didn't agree with. And I just felt it was time to be free, if you like. And it was only really after I'd left that people started approaching me and talking to me about doing something different or joining somebody different. I hadn't really intended to be honest. I'd intended just to retire and call it quits on politics. But I was approached by Reform, and they asked me if I would be willing to be involved. And they were sort of saying, look, it's a blank sheet of paper. You can talk about what you want to talk about and what matters to you. There were a number of other people who had come together and we'd been talking. So I agreed to do it. I joined in January, basically, middle of January. I think 11th of January was the official day I agreed to do it. We launched that day.
So this election that's coming up, there seems to be a lot of new parties suddenly competing in the Scottish parliamentary election. what would make your party stand out from the others?
Well, I think it's interesting. I mean, you're absolutely right. There are a lot of new parties appearing, and that's probably indicative of the dissatisfaction that people are feeling with politics. You know, the sort of core main parties are just not ticking the boxes for a lot of people now, for lots of different reasons. For me, in terms of reform, as I said, we started with a blank sheet of paper. We've come together really because of a number of things. First of all, the whole business of how the pandemic has been handled. A lot of us are very concerned about the removal of a lot of our rights and freedoms, and concerned about how those will come back to us and how we will ensure that we can return to normality. I mean, obviously, I come from a clinical background. Having managed front door services and medical units, I had a very good idea of what goes on in a hospital and what it's like, particularly in winter crisis. And what I was seeing was a lot of similarities of things that we have every winter, but not any movement forward in terms of how we handle them. So I was very concerned that after all the years and all the expectations of a potential pandemic, that we didn't appear to be ready, and some of the decisions we've made about restrictions and the objectivity of how a virus works was not great, in my view. So the direction of travel worried us. So we believe that we do need people who are willing to say, actually, we don't agree with that. That don't just get caught in the same mindset of how to deal with things. And we think there needs to be better preparation. So we've looked at the idea of having a reserve force for the NHS in the same way they have it for the armed forces, so that people like myself and other people who've spent many years in the NHS working, instead of just leaving at the end of our service or when we move on, we retain some ties, we retain a base level of training, so that in times of crisis, and it's not just about pandemics, as I said, we have basically winter crisis most years, that they can call on us to come and do some shifts, come and help out. Whereas now, if somebody like me wants to go and help out, I'd have to go through a whole training application process, and by the time I'm ready, crisis has passed. So it's about being properly prepared. The other side, I think, that really worried most of us was the way in which the economy is being handled and the way in which education has been handled. And we feel that there's a disconnect between the reality of how the economy really works and what drives the money, if you like, to pay for the NHS and to pay for good education and to pay for the welfare systems that we do need. We just feel that actually we're in decline. And if that isn't arrested, if that's not stopped soon, all the things we value, like, within our public services, we're going to lose them. And while everybody's squabbling about who can provide the most nurses, the most teachers, the most doctors, they're not looking at the fundamentals of how we ensure we get this sustainable future.
So, just going back to the COVID thing, we've discussed this a lot on the show. There's been a few political parties on that have been anti-mask and sort of stuff like that. And I've always taken up the point of looking at New Zealand and looking at the way they handled it and saying, well, that's the way I thought that Britain should have handled it, really, which was shut down international travel immediately, which was a weird thing for us. I think most people, when we went into lockdown March 23rd last year, it was like, right, okay, this is a necessity, we have to do it. And then in July when it said, and we're stopping international travel now, we went, what? We've all had to stay in our house, but people have been able to fly in and out of the country. And when you looked at somewhere like New Zealand where the borders were shut, and you went, well, there's got to be a correlation there. Shut your borders, the virus doesn't come in great numbers and you can control it. Not shutting your borders, and we get what we have in the UK, which is a disaster, really. I mean, it's been polished up and said that haven't we done well? And yes, the NHS has really stepped up and done a lot of good work, but really it's as you say, there should have been preventative stuff happening way before it got to that stage where the NHS was overpushed and needed to build hospitals and the SECC or build in the middle of London. Would you feel that's something you...
Yeah, I mean, I recognise some of what you're saying, but I think you also have to appreciate that New Zealand is different to the United Kingdom. We are very much a global hub in a way that New Zealand isn't. I think there was definitely some mistakes at the beginning. I mean, the first lockdown was a time to say, what's going on? What sort of virus are we dealing with? What measures do we need to take? But it felt like we kind of just locked down, waited and said, oh, things have declined a bit. We can all crack on again now. Whereas I think they didn't use that time as well as they could have done to really ascertain what steps they needed to take. And during that first lockdown, we did ascertain that it was predominantly old people or people with compromised immune systems that were going to be vulnerable to this virus in terms of death, really, in terms of the fact that it would hit you hard. But for the vast majority of young people, and in fact, the vast majority of people under 50 were not likely to be, at risk of losing their life from it. But despite that knowledge, we shut down the economy pretty much across the board without much real thought about what that meant and how that was going to work. And yet we could all still go to the supermarket. So you got this rather bizarre system where every man and his dog was going to the supermarket and mixing, but you couldn't go in a small shop that sold, sofas and might only have 3 of you in it at any given time, but you could pack into, the supermarket or the corner shop because it sold food. So I think it's more about saying, okay, what we're going to do here. And New Zealand, they did shut down and they did talk about eradicating the virus, but you can't eradicate it because the minute you open up, it probably will reappear again, and it can lie dormant and reappear. So I think there was a degree of naivety even in that first step. But they also, as I said, I think
you would say about New Zealand is, if, in terms of that, say naivety, is that they overreacted. But it's better to overreact and we overreacted slightly rather than just let's just keep going on and be fine. Because South Korea. I'm sure we haven't got viewers from that end of the world that'll be saying they got the wrong country. But South Korea as well, they reacted almost instantaneously, and they are set up for an understanding of how viruses work in terms of, because they had the SARS scare. So they're very much a case of the public was like, well, yeah, we're going to wear masks because that's like second nature to us now. And that's why there's an education level with the public as well that needs to be pushed through on how viruses are transferred.
Yeah, and it's also about kind of understanding, even with a mask. I mean, I don't fit into the category of being anti anything. I'm simply saying, does that make a difference? Does that actually work? Let's look at the relative benefit of it against the sort of opportunity gains and opportunity loss, if you like. So if you look at masks, for example, there are grades of masks that, yes, will prevent any virus transfer. But then there's a whole bunch of masks that frankly do little or nothing. And the way in which people wear them compromises any benefit they might have had. So I think, and then you've also got a degree of bacterial problem with masks as well. So if you look at everything, you've got to say, okay, how much is this going to do? So in places like Vietnam, Japan, quite often they do wear masks, but that's not actually always to do with spreading viruses. Sometimes it's to do with the dirt and the smog in the air. Yeah. And it's about stopping it going down your throat the whole time. So yes, they already have a much more normalized approach to wearing masks. We don't, and I'll be honest, I would not like to see us go down a normalization of mask wearing, because I also believe that your face is quite important. The social interaction of people a lot of it is done through facial expression and how we engage with people. And I think if we start wearing masks all the time, we are going to see more issues around mental health because people lose that ability to interact with people. And it's a very, mask wearing is not a comfortable way to live. It does make people more breathless if you're going upstairs. You get hotter. You tend to get sort of skin problems around your face if you're constantly breathing onto yourself in that way. So I think
as well there is an argument though for like more people to be wearing masks, like walking around Glasgow city centre. where there's a lot of emissions. Do you know what I mean? In terms of, as you say, there's a lot of pollution in the air coming out of motor vehicles.
I think it's a personal choice. This is the difference. I mean,
I'm not saying I'm mandatory. I'm saying it's like a cultural thing that we have to.
As an individual, yes, I mean, my daughter spent 4.5 years living in Vietnam, and she said she wore a mask a lot there because the sheer smog dirt, literally, that would clog your face. So it was quite shocking when you sort of took your mask off. So you wear it, yes, to protect yourself from that. But I think it is about personal choice. So I think if people understand it, if you're prone to asthma, or you're worried about the impact that smog and fumes and general pollution have, then yes, there's an argument. But again, if you're going to do that, wear a mask that works. And that's the other side to it. Don't convince yourself that you're protecting yourself with something that everything's going through in the first place.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. So the other main thing that will be coming up in May will be obviously every party. Now, we've had one or two parties that didn't really have a stance on it, but I was shocked by that any party standing in a Scottish Parliament would not have a stance on independence. Mm-hmm. So where does Reform UK Scotland stand on independence?
Well, we don't support separating the UK because we don't think there's a good, sound economic argument for it, or indeed a social argument for it. We very much believe that we need to harness the powers of, and they are very strong powers of devolution that we have, to do what Holyrood was set up to do, which is to bring democracy closer to the people. And we're not convinced that that's happened. At the moment, democracy has been centralised in Holyrood, which is really not the idea as far as we're concerned. We want to see it pushed out further, to local regional levels, for councils to have more power over how they deliver the services that they deliver, and a bigger say of how they use their budget. Because I certainly found, as a councillor, whilst the Scottish Government would tell us that our budget was no longer ring-fenced, the reality is, by the time we'd met all the requirements that had been laid down by the government in Holyrood, we didn't really have much room for manoeuvre, from a financial point of view. So, I think we need to do what people voted for. I mean, when Scotland voted for devolution, they didn't vote that they just moved it from one centralised power to another. They voted to have it power at a level that their personal vote would make a difference. So I think people have not always really understood, because there's an awful lot of rubbish talked about the faces of the country and how the economics work, etc. And I get that it's really complicated. But the reality is, all of us in Scotland, can benefit enormously from having that union, if you like, with the United Kingdom, because we do get more money to spend, whatever anybody says, and they can argue it till they're blue in the face, and I can show them exactly why we do. We do have more money to spend, so why would we want to cut that money? I mean, I don't. When I moved up here, one of the great benefits is I had access to GP quicker. The schooling was superb for my children. There were some really brilliant things about living in Scotland, raising a family in Scotland. And I've seen a lot of that eroded whilst everybody argued about whether we should give it all up and, kind of go backwards. And I see no point in going backwards. If somebody came to me and said, look, we've worked it all out and here's the reality, and Scotland would be better off, then fine, I'd look at it. But I have looked very hard at what's been presented so far, and there's no substantial, meaningful argument being made that actually says we would be better to break up the UK and go it alone. None whatsoever.
Talking about devolution and the powers that the Scottish Government have, obviously there's a recent thing where the UK Government is going to take them to court to stop a bill being passed on the Rights of the Children bill, and there was the one that was that was paused and things. Do you think that that's something where the Scottish Parliament should have the powers to not be retrospectively told, well, actually, we're going to take that power right back off you and we're going to change that? Do you think that was maybe a misstep by the UK government to come in and sort of retrospectively change laws?
Well, that's not really what happened, and I think again this is about how things are spun. The UK government wrote to the Scottish government and explained that actually the act they were about to pass would cut across reserved matters, and therefore you couldn't actually, it wasn't competent, it was the argument. It wasn't competent to make that decision in the Scottish Parliament in the way that it was done. And I think you have to be realistic about that. You cannot just say, okay, we're going to decide to do this, even though it's going to affect, something that we have no power over. And I think, the UNCR, the rights of the child. I mean, I was actually a youth worker and delivering children's services when we very first sat down to talk about how we would incorporate some of those things into what we did and into our youth practice on a daily basis. And I think we've done that very successfully. I mean, I think you'd find it very hard to say that we don't respect the rights of children in Scotland. But I think a lot of what then goes on in Parliament, a lot of it is virtuous signalling rather than really making a difference on the ground. I mean, you were telling me earlier that you work with youngsters and, with young people in terms of filming. I mean, would you honestly say that you don't respect their rights and that the way in which you deliver your practice, it doesn't respect?
Sometimes I wish I didn't have to.
That's different. That's different. You know what I mean? I mean, we are not, the rights of the children were really originally devised in countries where children literally were put to work. They were slaves from a very early age. They had no access to education. They had no access to what we would consider basic things. We're way ahead of most of the world on those things. And you look at everything. We have a youth parliament. Children have a say in so much of what happens to them in their lives now. So it's not that we had this yawning horrible gap. I think it was more that sort of being able to say, oh, we've incorporated it into law, that makes us somehow special. Well, I think it's what we do on the ground that makes us special. It's what we do in reality that makes us special, not whether we create more statutory acts in Parliament. And I think our practice is good on the ground.
So, Brexit, I saw from the website, I picked up a vibe that you were pro-Brexit sort of party.
Yes, absolutely.
And Brexit is going through now. It's kind of gone through. We're kind of there.
It's gone through.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's there, but it isn't there in terms of we have the problem in Northern Ireland. In terms of what's happening in Northern Ireland. And there is an argument that Northern Ireland is almost getting left in the EU and Scotland is getting taken out of the EU. And that's a nation of 4 countries. 3 of the countries are getting what they voted for and 1 country isn't. Can you see a disconnect there with the way that's been worked out with the Brexit deal for the UK?
Well, it's funny because, I mean, there's a couple of things I would say about that. And the first is that, and I know you've had this discussion before, it was a UK vote and it was a UK membership. So only the UK can stay in or leave the EU. The 4 bits that make up the UK were not members in their own rights. It was only the UK that was a member. So the way in which people talk about it is incorrect, if you like, when they talk about, well, we've been taken out of our membership of the EU. We were collectively a membership as the UK. And have they made a brilliant job of the deal? No, they haven't. I think that the EU played a lot of games during that decision and there was a lot of pressure. It went right to the wire, as we know, which I always said it would. No great surprise there. The EU have a major, major problem. The UK deciding to leave, as one of only 3 net contributors at the time to the EU project, leaves a big hole in the EU's finances. It also rocks the boat because despite what everybody likes to think, there's quite a few other countries that have been seriously considering whether or not they really want to be part of the EU project anymore. So the EU were very much wanting to give a message that, leaving's not easy and we'll make it as tough as possible. And we want to make it as difficult as possible. That's part of the ploy, if you like, around the whole conversation. But at the same time, they can't afford to scupper the relationship completely. So you've got this quite difficult balance of saying, well, actually, we do need to trade with you and we do want to be friends ultimately, but a lot of other people might leave as well if it looks too good and too easy. I think the whole Northern Ireland thing, it's a very difficult conversation because the what's going on gets mixed up, and the troubles are not new. I mean, as you all know, the troubles in Northern Ireland are long-standing. And the arrangements that exist in Northern Ireland already as part of the separation of Ireland, and also as part of the Good Friday Agreement in terms of the peace deal in Northern Ireland, means that actually you've already got agreements in place. And the EU, for all their noises about saying that they wanted to protect Ireland, no, they didn't. They were trying to cut right across those deals. And I think to some degree, opposition members at the time, opposition parties, should have realised what was going on and should have supported and backed not having that disrupted, and they didn't. You know, they were working behind the scenes with the EU, trying to make things more difficult. So, to be sitting there complaining about it now, I think is really hypocritical. Because if we had stood united in terms of dealing with that issue, then Brexit would not be as big a problem in Northern Ireland as it is at the moment. So, those who are complaining are part of the problem, not part of the solution. But I think it will work itself through. I think people will be surprised in the long run how it does work itself through. But it would be utterly wrong to say the troubles that are kicking off in Northern Ireland are all about Brexit, because they are absolutely not. And anybody who knows anything about Northern Ireland will understand that.
Yeah, I mean, there is talk that, there's a lot of feeling that effectively when we talk about Scotland and separatism and Scotland's independence, that there could be a reunification of Ireland as a result of Brexit. But it's growing in popularity than it was 10 years ago. There's a bit more of a foothold in terms of, and a peaceful transition, I might add. It looks like there's a more likelihood of that, because if Ireland is cut off and becomes part of the EU and has to go through border checks to get into the rest of UK, it's going to feel like it's separated in more part of Ireland than it is part of the UK. Can you see how that's going to be one of the major problems that the UK government will have to deal with?
Yes, but you have to remember that a lot of the freight, the trade, etc. I mean, the majority of trade comes into the UK, not over to the EU. So there is quite a wish list in the sort of anti-Brexit camp to talk up that concept, but ultimately that won't be the direction of travel, because in the end it does come down to the direction of travel of your trade. It does come down to the monetary pluses and minuses. I mean, Ireland, Southern Ireland, benefited enormously from the EU, but things are changing there as well. The benefits of the EU to them are not going to be in the same sort of league at all, and they are going to have to rethink a lot of their economics and how they operate as well. So I think it is a very, very complicated subject. It's not just because this has happened, that's going to happen. It's just not that simple. But I am confident in the long run that this will work itself through. And Northern Ireland is not suddenly going to be sucked into a unification through Brexit. That's not going to happen. And
just before we go on to the final bit, just to revisit a bit of the independence stuff, because I've got a wee message there. It's about, so if there is a majority of pro-independence parties in Parliament, which polls suggest there will be, would the Reform Scotland Party, as a party that's against Scottish independence, be against another referendum?
I think there's two things there. First of all, having a majority in Parliament doesn't necessarily mean you have the majority of the voters, remember. I mean, I know you've spoken before about the fact that the union vote struggles because it is divided between several parties, as opposed to what is up to date, and that might not be the case, but up to date, those that want separation have always been tended to be one party, so it's easy to garner their votes into seats. So I think the first thing you have to look at is it the majority of the people or just the majority of the seats? Because that's not the same thing. The second thing is, ultimately, it isn't a decision for Holyrood. It's not a devolved issue. And actually, if you want to make the case for breaking up the UK, the place you make that argument is in Westminster, because it's a reserved issue. And I think to basically get yourself elected to our devolved parliament to wreck devolution is actually a really worrying state of affairs. Because the whole point about the devolved parliament, as I said earlier, was to enable us to run our public services, make our decisions that affected our daily lives on a more localised basis, to have more control over them, to run systems that work for us in Scotland. And what we've got now is a bunch of people who want to go into Parliament to destroy that, to take that away from us, to wreck devolution, to make it fail, so that people will think that they're being hard done by.
I would pick up on one of those points about getting a majority percentage of the vote to enable to get a referendum. If that was the case, no party would ever get a referendum ever in any of the parliaments in the UK, because the Conservative Party wouldn't have been able to have the Brexit referendum because they didn't get a majority vote to become...
Well, actually, I mean, the Brexit referendum, remember, was supported by a number of parties, even those who subsequently said they didn't want it. So referendums shouldn't be frequent things. They should be very unusual things. You know, these binary choice referendums actually divide society enormously, and therefore you should use them very sparingly and with great caution, because they do not unite society. They do not actually allow us to move forward effectively. And I say that as somebody who did vote for Brexit and who did support Brexit and was glad that we had a Brexit referendum. And I'm sure if I was in favour of separatism, I'd have been delighted that actually we'd had an independence referendum. Would I immediately be calling for another one because I lost? No. Because the whole point about referendums is you have them because you believe that the issue is of paramount importance to be decided. But once it's decided, if you're on the losing side, you don't just say, oh, right, well, let's have another one. You know, that shows a degree of lack of concern for actually your society and your people, because you're actually saying to the majority of people, we didn't like the way you voted, so we're going to make you do it again. That is part of the reason, actually, funnily enough, I didn't want to be in the EU, because that's exactly what the EU did to everybody. Every time they voted a way they didn't like, they said, we don't like that, do it again, until they got the result they wanted. So in effect, you ended up with a small group of people telling the majority that, you know, unless they decided and agreed with what they agreed with, they would keep at them until they gave in. That's not how we should do it. And I was, you know, I was quite comfortable that it was fair enough. We had a referendum because they had a majority government, and, you know, Scotland decided and agreed we'd have a referendum, and we had it. That's it, you know, done. You know, you have to wait a wee while. You have to actually move on. We've just had Brexit. Let's get over that.
It's been 7 years.
See what happens. We've had 2 referendums, elections every year. For God's sake, you know, our economy's in turmoil. Our education is in the doldrums. You know, people are struggling. You know, we need to sort a few things out, then see where we are. And then if they want to come back with a majority in Parliament and a majority, you know, uprising in Scotland to say, let's talk about it again. But I think they're using failure to actually breed grievance, to suggest to people that actually they voted wrongly last time, so they've got to change their minds this time. I think if they really cared about Scotland, and if they really cared about the people of Scotland, they'd be making damn sure that everybody has a good job. They'd making damn sure that our children were literate and numerate and could compete on a global stage from an education point of view. Instead, look across the board. You know, we've been in decline in the 30 years I've lived in Scotland. You know, 20 years ago, I would have said to anybody, come and choose to live in Scotland. It's an amazing place. Your children will get a brilliant education. You know, the scenery is wonderful. We're not crowded. You can get in a GP appointment. If you need an op, you'll get it pretty quick. You know, all of these things were real positives about Scotland. They're not anymore. You know, we've lost our grip on the things that are important while we've all been arguing about referendums. And I think we need a break. We need time to regroup. We need time to focus on the things that are important. And then if you want to come back and talk about all that again when we're all stable and things are looking good for everybody, you know, and to be honest with you, if I was a member of the SNP, I'd want to prove that I could run Scotland really well first. I'd want to show them, give everybody a glimpse of how brilliant Scotland can be. Instead, what they've done is run it into the ground and then told us that it's all Westminster's fault and therefore we should go it alone. Well, take a long, hard look at the economics because it doesn't stack up.
It's interesting when you were talking about like overpopulation in terms of it's crowded. There was a study I seen years ago. I'm talking like 2008, where it was a chap from Norway was talking about how Scotland is populated wrongly.
It is, yeah.
In terms of, and it comes down to a little bit of the fact that there's so much land owned by, like just empty swathes of land that is just owned by 2 or 3 lords, and then you've got populations concentrated in Glasgow, Edinburgh, and just concentrated in very thick pockets, and then there's just wilderness. And it's great to have wilderness, it's great, but we tend not to spread out at all in Scotland, which is kind of bizarre. We spread out in terms of, you know, big massive gaps between where we live, and we need to start to think about spreading out the population a little bit more, so that, because we talk about 5.3 million people living in the country that the size we are, there shouldn't be overcrowding at any space, because it's a massive country for the size of the population.
Yeah, I don't think, I mean, I think you need to be careful that you don't mix up the concept that some people own a lot of land with the idea that everybody else is shoved into another place. I mean, obviously people tend to live in a place because, you know, during industrialization, they lived where the jobs were, and obviously they came around centres, particularly around the central belt, where you had the jobs and you had the availability, and the families grew there and stayed there. So I don't think it's so much about land ownership, but it is to do with accessibility. It is to do with having infrastructure. It's to do with having job availability. And again, you know, Scotland has had quite a boom over the last few years of improving road infrastructure, you know, certainly over the time. But I mean, I live in the Borders. We don't have a motorway of any description in the Borders. You know, going east to west across where I live, you know, is a country lane affair. So, you know, we are still quite inaccessible in many places. And even if you look at sort of modern job opportunities, you know, our broadband offer is still a bit dodgy in a lot of places. So people have tended to congregate where we've got accessibility, where you've got jobs, and where you've got, you know, sort of opportunity. And let's be honest with you, a lot of our children have looked at our rural living places and said, oh, I want to go to the city where, you know, there's bars and nightclubs, and, you know, so we lose a lot of our youngsters to more exciting places to live, as they say.
I think it's when you compare. What I was trying to think was when you compare it to other countries, the likes of like Canada, which is much more spread out in terms of geographic, very small population, very massive landmass, but then people are quite willing to travel 60 miles to get to the work as a standard. It's just like, that's it, that's fine. Whereas traveling 60 miles in Scotland is a trek. It's a trek and a half. If you try to get from Edinburgh to Glasgow in the morning, or Glasgow to Edinburgh in the morning, it's a 2-lane motorway for 20 miles of that, and it's quite a struggle.
No, you would need. I mean, when you go to places like Canada and America, where they think driving long distances is normal, you know, you've got wide roads, you've got straight roads. You know, although you've got a 55-mile-an-hour speed limit, which can be slowing, but yes, I mean it's a different ball game. I mean, I commuted into Glasgow for a while when I was doing some studying, and oh, good grief! You know, you either had to leave at sort of 4:30 in the morning to beat the traffic to be, you know, your lecture by a reasonable time, or forget getting there for 9 by leaving at 7, not a hope in hell. So yes, we've got some major issues around that. And we haven't, even our public transport system hasn't really quite cracked it in terms of allowing commuting efficiently. So yes, if we want to spread the population, but I'm not in favour of people commuting long distances. I actually think we need to spread out job opportunity. So we've got to make it, possible for people to actually run businesses, set up businesses, have broadband, have good access, be able to get their goods shipped from wherever they are without a problem, and not have to pay the extra postage if they do. So you've got to think about these things. You don't really want the whole population to be commuting 60 miles a day, because that's, to those who are worried about pollution and all the rest of it, that's not a good solution. But I am a great believer. I mean, we came to Scotland to set up our manufacturing company. My husband is Scottish, obviously comes from Scotland. So, but Scotland has the potential to be a real powerhouse of manufacturing, and was. Let's be honest, it has a really good history of that. And we haven't really harnessed it. We've become really itty-bitty about what we do in Scotland. And we haven't even protected the industries that we are really good at. And they dream of industries that, wanting to compete, say, with, Silicon Valley or whatever. But again, you have to look at why people go there and what they're looking for, because it's not just about the job sometimes, it's about the lifestyle that goes with it. And we can't always offer that same competitive lifestyle. So we need to look at what do we have and what kind of people want to come and live and work in Scotland, and what do our children want? Most of us would like our children to stay relatively close. So, what's going to make them do that? So we need jobs of all sorts. We need the cost of living not to go through the roof. You need to be able to buy a house or rent a house, because housing is the biggest cost. You need to have entertainment that interests people, that they can participate in. And that varies enormously. And we have to have good education for our children and good healthcare. And if we have those things, then people want to come to Scotland the same way we did. We came back for that reason, because we were living in the southeast at the time my husband left the forces. And it's, the southeast has lots going for it, but it also has a lot of negatives, not least of all the cost of living, the sheer number of people, the lack of space, and culturally it's very different, compared to, say, where I live now, where community is hugely important, and vast number of us volunteer and do things for our community because we all benefit back from it. I like that. I like community. I like tradition. I like being part of something that is very much a family. And we have that in shovel loads in Scotland, but I sometimes feel we don't promote it. And what we're known for now is bitching, arguing, and grievance procedures. And it's a sad indictment of a place that I love. And I know a lot of us really know that we could do so much with if we got our act right.
So just to finish this up, because we're coming up to quarter to 10. Why should people vote for the Reform UK Scotland Party?
Because I suppose we're talking about things in a different way. We're not laying out a long list of freebies for you. We're not going to say we'll do this, we'll do that. Hundreds of promises. What we're actually saying to you is we are going to look at it properly. We're putting forward an economic plan that we think will really grow our economy. And if we can grow our economy, then we get better public services. And we're going to look at things in terms of reforming them. We don't want to manage decline. We don't want to just leave everything to go as it is. Because right now, I'm sure you are aware of this, but we spend nearly 60% of our GDP on our public services at the moment. That is unsustainable. That's not a sort of airy-fairy comment. It's a fact. If we go on like this, we're going to lose the things we value most. We are going to lose our NHS. We're going to lose all those freebies that everybody's given everybody at the moment. They're all going to go. So what we're saying to you, we want parties that think, that look at it properly, that look to the future, that aren't just looking at it in the short term, you know, what can we offer you to get you to vote for us today, but we're not really going to be interested until 5 years' time when we want you to vote for us again, and then we'll offer you another load of freebies to get you to vote for us. We're saying to you, we're going to look at it properly. We want it to work for you as the voter. We want to make sure that you're getting what you should be getting, which is local democracy, which means that when you vote, you can know that somebody's going to make sure that the services that you depend on and the jobs you need will be there. Because if you don't, then everything that matters to you, whatever you believe in politically, so it doesn't matter whether you're right, left, centre, independent supporting, or, you know, unionists, the fact is you're going to lose it all, regardless of whether vote to separate. So we've got to sort it out. We've got to sort it out soon.
Well, thanks for coming on. It's been lovely speaking to you, and we'll speak to you soon.
Will do. Thanks.